Kenneth Faried isn't well liked in Denver. Boogie gets a stat named after him, and the Bucks are over 500. It's the Boxscore Geeks show.
Welcome to another Boxscore Geeks show. I'm your host, Andres Alvarez, also known as Nerd Numbers, and as always, this show is produced by the voice of God himself, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Give a shout out real quick, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? Good evening.
Nice to hear from you. All right, well, tonight's show, as we mentioned, we'll be discussing Kenneth Faried, a player near and dear to my heart. More interesting, I'll put in quotes, advanced stats, including the now dubbed Boogie Board. Cute name, by the way, I'll give it that. I'm always a fan of using a pun or whatever if you're going to name something, so good job. And then I'm actually a Wisconsin, I'm not going to say native, but an inhabitant now, and the Bucks are actually good, and I don't know if this is for real. Now, before we start that, every week we do a poll. Again, if you have any ideas for good polling software, I really like Polar Bee, but apparently they'll be going under at the end of the year. They were purchased by Google, and Google doesn't want to keep the tool going. So with that said, if you have any ideas for good poll software, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep using Polar Bear until it's out. Last week, we asked you about Kobe versus Nash, and as commenter, I'm going to mess this up. I apologize. I think it's Zidangzu said 70% of the general public will vote for Kobe over Nash, maybe even 95%. I said 70, I meant to say 90, so 90% of the general public. Absolutely correct, I agree, and that's why Boxscore Geeks fans, I just love you guys. Last week we asked you Kobe or Steve Nash. Now, to be fair, we did seed it a little. I did an entire show about how Steve Nash is amazing. But currently, the poll ends at 118 for Steve Nash and 27 for Kobe. So that's why the Boxscore Geeks fans are the most nuanced, best basketball fans out there, because you can answer questions like Kobe over Nash correctly.
I'll take all the confirmation bias I can get, Dre.
I can make that a shirt now, man. I'll take all the confirmation bias. Well, there was a really good Penny Arcade on that. I'll have to throw it in the links, but he basically said, I'm going to go on the internet to find people that agree with me. And then the punchline is he doesn't, but he still doesn't change his mind. And we're back. Thanks to the brilliance of film editing. Hopefully you won't notice this, but we were gone for just a second there. But we're going to be getting right into our first topic, which is Kenneth Faried. There was a recent article that was posted over at Slam Online, I'm getting up in front of me right now, that basically pointed out that Kenneth Faried is, and the cover of it says he's not well liked. He's not well liked in Denver, and kind of talks about Tim Connolly. And I've also seen some recent articles. I didn't have one for you, Brian, but basically how Tim Connolly is just not very good at his job. And what's interesting to me is that with Kenneth Faried is, first off, just in general, his overall value is, in my opinion, undervalued by everyone. There was a piece recently by Zach Lowe called "The NBA's Bigs Problems." I actually looked over it right before the show, and like many Grantland articles, its ratio of words to graphics and or relevant statistics is about 1,000,000,000 to 1. So, a lot to dig through if you want to. But kind of the crux of it is the NBA has evolved.
At this point, I kind of cut out for a few seconds. I'm not going to re-record anything, so I'm just going to let you look at my silly face. And gosh, look at my crazy hair. I kind of go off on a rant about how I think the idea of bigs needing to shoot from outside is silly, but the idea that Faried's market value may be below what he was paid, and I compare him to Dennis Rodman, which is where we come out.
And rest assured, the Bulls do not get a second three-peat. Without Dennis Rodman, Michael Jordan does not go down as the greatest player of all time, because Magic Johnson's the first player to win 3 Finals MVPs. Michael Jordan wouldn't have as many rings as him. People would say teamwork, et cetera, et cetera. So Dennis Rodman is the complete reason Michael Jordan got as popular. And Dennis Rodman's value was way undervalued on the open market. That said, his production was off the charts, but that doesn't mean that a team needed to pay him like Michael Jordan. They could pay him less because the market didn't value him as much. And I think Faried is in a similar case. So when I see people that are basically denigrating Faried's, and this is laughable to me, it's a 4-year, $50 million deal. That is nothing for a player of Faried's value. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about this in the next segment, but people will come up to me and say, But what about Kenneth Faried's defense? It's really weak. Yeah, it's true. It probably is. When Synergy stats was up, we miss you, Synergy. Basically, what it said about Faried is he wasn't a good defender, but he wasn't a horrible defender. You can say undersized, but his arms are big, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, the simple point is if you look at all the stuff Faried does really well, he's amazing at rebounds. He's a perfect, what I call hockey teammate, meaning, he is great for getting assisted dunks. The contributions he gives are just amazing. And just because the market doesn't value him, just because people fall for the notion that big men need to shoot from outside, which, there are players like Dirk Nowitzki and Kevin Love where there is value to that, but that is certainly not a requisite for a modern big man. It certainly does not denigrate Faried's value. So to me, that's just absurd that people don't realize how good this contract is, and the kind of notion that he's not liked in Denver. This has always been funny to me, which is it's really difficult in professional sports to deal with the fact that a lot of these players are people you wouldn't like working with, and I hope many of us have don't hope, but many of us have probably dealt with people that we don't like their personalities, but we can accept that they actually are very useful in the workforce environment. Some people I've had that are kind of what you'd call obnoxious jerks. I notice arrogance and obnoxiousness comes up a lot, but they were the most candid. Some people in meetings that seemed mean, well, when I did a lot of industry work, were the people that were saying the stuff that needed to be said, that were being candid and honest. And if you didn't listen to them, you're basically going to be unhappy 6 months down the line when the people that were nice and optimistic got your project off base. There are people that, don't get back to you on emails, but, turn out, do the work that you need. So in the regard, the NBA is full of these players. The NBA is full of players that you may not like on a personal note, but they do the things you need to win games, and that's just one of the trade-offs. Dennis Rodman, by the way, is the prototypical version of this. They hated him in the Spurs. He, showed up late for games because he was taping wrestling promos or whatever. He just acted outlandish. They hated him there. And it turns out, though, that basically him and David Robinson, almost said Tim Duncan, him and David Robinson were the only reason that team was successful. Just because a team doesn't like a player, you kind of have to ask what you're paying for. Are you paying for someone you like, or are you paying for someone that's going to put W's in the win-loss column? Faried is currently the Nuggets' best player, and that actually brings up another problem, is when people are basically saying, should the Nuggets just blow this up and start over? There's a little something to that, in that Faried and Hickson, who are both actually playing well per minute on the Nuggets right now. Brian, if you put the Boxscore Geeks team stats for the Nuggets in front of everybody, basically they're both very good players. And right after the Nuggets signed away Costa Koufos, what I would say to them if I were their advisors, at this point your team really needs to trade for a big man who can score really well, someone maybe like Costa Koufos. Oh, God, that was such a horrible trade. But JJ Hickson and Kenneth Faried are really close in skill set, and as a result, you're not going to get both of them on the court for 30 plus minutes. You should get one of them on the court for 30 plus minutes. Nuggets, just whatever. So they could actually, in theory, trade away Faried and get some good players and do team construction. I'm just not sold that this team has any idea about team construction based on the team they put together. They basically have said since taking over, let's just ignore these bigs that Masai Ujiri got us and get a bunch of guards and small forwards and that aren't effective. And that really confuses me. So that said, in theory, they could trade Faried, but the problem is his contract is just so good. I don't see you getting back similar value. I don't think many people realize this, that in the NBA, if you're over the salary cap and you make a trade, you basically have to have salaries that kind of match. And so that means if you've got a really, really good, win per dollar contract, if you're going to trade it, you need to get another good win per dollar contract. That's really rough. The alternative is you can get lots of good picks. First off, I think the value of draft picks is overrated. There's a really good piece by Dave Barry that points out that basically if you look at the top 3 draft picks over the history of the last, I think, 20 years or something, basically, it's not even as good of a coin flip as if you're going to get a productive NBA player. That's because it's really hard to guess in the draft. Additionally, if you trade Faried for draft picks, guess what? You're going to improve that team. So you're not getting top 3, top 5 picks with Faried unless Faried's traded to like a really, really horrible team that's also really, really poorly run. So unless he's traded like the Knicks, even then, you're not going to get good picks. So I don't see them being able to trade away Faried and get back good value, particularly with how I don't see this team being well run. So this is a case which is kind of funny because the perception seems to be the Nuggets front office is a mess. no lie there. The Nuggets front office messed up the Faried dealing, and I think there might be a little truth to that, but the reality is they may have stumbled onto a really good player that's going to help them in the future as long as they don't freak out. And as such, the Nuggets are botching things up right now with Faried. Again, I'm going to side with Faried over the Nuggets. When you have a poorly run front office and you have people saying they don't like this player, why would I trust that front office? Mosey Platt, this was an argument we'd had all the time. So, for instance, two players, James Harden and Kevin Love, he basically pointed out, these players aren't really stars or great players because the coaches that they're under don't really, don't play them in starting minutes. Their organizations don't like them. And it goes, well, yeah, if you have a poorly run organization, why on earth am I trusting them over a star player? And, you look at James Harden in Houston and things seem to be going well. Okay, you look at Kevin Love in Cleveland, well, bad example, but we'll see if he turns it around. But the simple point is, if the Nuggets is poorly run, Faried is a great talent. Faried's on a great contract. I'm not going to side with the organization saying, well, we don't like him. Good for you. You're mucking things up with Faried. He's playing the lowest minutes per game he had. He's playing lower minutes per game than he was playing under George Karl. And my biggest complaint about George Karl was he was underplaying Kenneth Faried. So good job, Nuggets. You've got a coach worse than George Karl. You've got a GM, unsurprisingly, much worse than Masai Ujiri. Our third segment's going to be about the Milwaukee Bucks, Brian, and I just saying I may not actually regret leaving Denver with how bad that team is. As always, usually at the end of each segment, Brian, I ask you to add. You got anything to add on Faried before I go into our next segment?
No, I think the Slam Online article pretty much backs you up. The league source where he gets this from, let me put it back up on screen here, but basically the indictment that the league source says is that gets glossed over. He says crazy S__. He thinks he's the guy and the other guys take exception to his contract. So that's their problem with him, is that he thinks he's the guy, and he's probably not wrong about that. He probably is their best player. So I think the article backs it up.
Yeah, and I mean, by the way, just this drives me nuts. So it says adding yet another imperfect four-man to their lot. The notion when people bring up, and this is going to lead us perfectly into our next segment about the boogie board, is I hate this notion when people say that these players have flaws in their game. Because it's not true, because every player, unless your name is Chris Paul or LeBron James, has flaws in your game. Dwight Howard can't shoot threes. Certain players, actually LeBron James tends to be turnover prone, but I give him a pass because he passes the ball a lot. So many great players have things that they don't do well. It's really hard to do everything well in the NBA. So it drives me crazy when we look at players like Faried and point out his flaws and are just perfectly well. And, people overlook the fact that Kobe Bryant just, doesn't shoot the ball that well in the clutch, which is odd to me and is horrible from three relative to a shooting guard. Just overlook it. But, Kenneth Faried's the flawed one. Now, on that note, the kind of contrapositive to that is something that Kirk Goldsberry has done a few times with Grantland. And I really like Kirk Goldsberry when he kind of burst onto the scenes. He is a PhD. He was at Harvard, and what his basic background was geography. He made these really amazing shooting charts to kind of show people what NBA players shooting looked like. And that was a visualization that I loved. And if you go over to Nylon Calculus, they've really taken the ball and run with that. It's a fantastic way of doing it. And since then, Jeremy Britton and I wrote a piece together about the Kobe assist, which is the last kind of, I'm going to call BS stat, I'm sorry, that Kurt Goldsberry came up with, that was basically the notion that a player that takes a shot that is more likely to be rebounded is somehow helping his team. So he called it the Kobe assist because what he noticed was a ton of Kobe's misses were rebounded by big men like, Pau Gasol or Dwight Howard, who then put them back for shots. And so maybe Kobe was adding value. And basically it was like, well, that's kind of weird that you're giving value to the shooter who's missing the shot and not these offensive rebounders who have been amazing at, rebounding their entire career with or without Kobe. And the reason I kind of take exception to these is these stats, what they kind of do, you've always brought this up with me, Brian, is magnitude. What they kind of do is they zoom in on a player and try and say, hey, this player actually does this thing really, really well. And you have to ask two questions. First off, how much is that helping the player's game? And then how much is that actually worth in the grand scheme of things? So the most recent stat he's come up with is something called the boogie board. Give full credit to, if you're going to, make a pun on a stat, you got to make the pun on the stat. So good job there. And the idea is this, you take a shot, you miss the shot, you get your own rebound, you put it back, boom, doesn't that help? By the way, the wins produced way of looking at that would be it's -1 points for the shot, +1 short points for the offensive rebound, -1 point for the additional shot, +2 points for the putback, possibly more points for if you're fouled. So, basically what we're saying is that offensive rebound just negates the cost of the first shot. You're back to net zero. So we don't consider it a positive. Kind of one of the reasons that Kurt Goldsberry is going to say it's a positive thing, right, is you get a more favorable shot with the offensive rebound, which is definitely true. But one of the things I've noticed, and this happened actually in the original Sloan paper for RPM, or it was called RAPM in the Sloan paper. It has since been called RPM, being picked up by ESPN, is it kind of proves itself to be kind of flawed in that it tells you it's not that big. So what he basically says is, last year he, this is referring to Cousins, recovered 13%. Now that sounds high, but then you say 78 total of his misses and also converted those self rebounds into more points than anybody else. So basically what he's saying, and if you look at, what he's saying is that DeMarcus Cousins 78 times was able to get an offensive rebound and put it back for extra points. And all we have to do, though, is if you look at DeMarcus Cousins last year, he took almost 1,200 shots. That's nothing. That's a drop in the barrel. And then additionally, if we actually look at DeMarcus Cousins, and DeMarcus Cousins this season is playing well. He's not a star. He's not worth the contract he's got, but he is definitely playing better than he has in past. And sorry, I'm getting this up in front of me, trying to be crafty, but I'm clearly failing. But DeMarcus Cousins is, at this point, shooting about 57% true shooting. What I will say to that is that hits this threshold where I do want him taking almost every shot. I am fine with the notion of DeMarcus Cousins shooting a lot. All of his shooting is helping his team. But at 57.6% true shooting, he's not an elite scorer. He's not at the levels that we've seen players like Kevin Love, LeBron James, Dirk Nowitzki. He is a very good shooter, and that's with this advantage. So basically, when we zoom in on what Kurt Goldsberry is talking about, these boogie boards, and currently this season, I don't know how many games this goes through, but he has DeMarcus Cousins listed at 29. And, at this point, he's taken close to 300 shots. So again, he's actually somewhere in that, he might be at 13%, but like 10% of his shots. So this is a minute amount of his game. And then when we actually look at his shooting holistically, how is DeMarcus Cousins shooting overall at 57 point, or is it 57.6? 57.5. Sorry, I was reading another one. At 57.5% true shooting, his overall shooting is good, but not elite. So why are we focusing on this very tiny, tiny thing to show why DeMarcus Cousins is really, really good, instead of looking holistically and saying, how good of a player is he? And one of the other notes to kind of make about DeMarcus Cousins, if we look at his game as a whole, what we really notice is, why isn't DeMarcus Cousins a star player? He actually does look like one. Currently this season, he's getting 18.3 rebounds per 48. He is scoring at just an absurd rate, 35.5 points per 48 minutes on, like I said, efficient shooting. And what we notice is he turns the ball over a ton. These have been out of control his entire career. Per 48 minutes, he turns the ball over roughly 5 times. The average center is going to turn the ball over about 3 times in the same period of time. And additionally, his personal fouls, he gets about 7.5 personal fouls per 48 minutes. Use the math. Basically, that means he fouls out every game if he plays a full game, versus an average center who's only at 5.6. Those two parts of his game are actually what keeps him from being an elite player. And this is what's interesting to me, is that we can focus on this very narrow portion of DeMarcus Cousins' offense and say it's a good thing. And it is, that is a positive thing. And great, good job. Basketball's not a game of horse. It's not about being more impressive than the other players. It's about, as a whole, doing all things well enough to help your team. And that's kind of the point. At the very, very end of Kurt Goldsberry's piece, he basically, I'll see if I can get this up in front of me, talks about why isn't DeMarcus Cousins. So he says, let me get this in front of me. I'm sorry, I think I'm missing the proportion. So sorry, I know this is always exciting when you're just like, I'm going to read this, and you mess it up. But okay, so he goes, and yet he still hasn't earned a true superstar reputation. Perhaps it's because he plays for a team that's been absent from the playoffs since 2006. But there's hope for Sacramento. If anybody in the league is going to turn a sudden miss into a make, it's Boogie. Okay, well, his superstar reputation, I actually agree with Kurt Goldsberry. It's surprising because usually points and rebounds are going to get you that superstar, belief from people. But what I'll just say is, if you look at his game holistically, if he were to reduce his turnovers by half a turnover per game, that would be better than if he doubled the number of boogie boards he gets. So why are we focusing on this very narrow thing that he's really good at instead of looking at his game holistically and saying, is he helping or hurting the team? And I think I made a tweet a week or two ago that basically said, as we get more and more advanced stats, we basically just give more and more ways to help confirmation bias. This is what we got. The boogie board, which I don't hate as a statistic. I actually don't. I think it's kind of cool. I just think it's another one of those things. Baseball's had this forever where you say, this player is batting 3 for 10 against left-handed hitters in the month of July in East Coast stadiums on Tuesday. Well, cool, that's an interesting stat, but what does that do if you're trying to construct a team? What does that do if you're trying to improve DeMarcus Cousins? If you were a coach trying to help DeMarcus Cousins, would you care about the boogie board? No, you wouldn't care at all. You would say, get your turnovers and personal fouls under control. So it's an interesting stat, but I think it's just kind of indicative of the stats industry, and that this saddens me that this is the direction we're going. We're going towards, let's use these sports view cameras, let's use these player tracking, let's use all of these advanced, statistics, I'll put that in quotes, to just find ways to show that players are really good at unique skills instead of trying to ask questions that, actually change team construction and change how we view players. That's kind of my problem. And as always, Brian, got anything to add before we go to our final topic?
Yeah, that was my first impression reading this too, is that offensive rebounds and shooting percentage are already captured in the box score, so I'm not sure what this is adding. It's pretty much a fun fact.
Yeah, it's a fun fact, not an advanced stat. I like it. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't add anything. And that sounds really mean. It doesn't, it's a cool statistic. It's a cool story. And again, this is a dig, apparently that's all I do. Maybe I should steal the ESPN Watch moniker from, Jonathan Wild, but basically it's just, that seems to be Grantland to me. It's a lot of words to make stuff sound cool, to describe things, to give narrative, without actually answering interesting questions a lot of the time. Sorry. And then, just ESPN in general. So that's kind of my take. And that doesn't really tie to our last topic, but this is just more of a head scratcher. And actually, let me check, because I believe they did play tonight. But the Milwaukee Bucks are good. This was really shocking to me, and kind of the only reason I even noticed it was because I live in Wisconsin, and then also one of the friends of the podcast, friends of the Boxscore Geek, Ty Willinghans, does live in Wisconsin as well. They fell to the Brooklyn Nets in double overtime in the revenge game for the Nets against Jason Kidd. So I guess that's fitting, but they still have a winning record. But the Brooklyn Nets let Jason Kidd go. Sorry, I clearly mucked that up. But the Milwaukee Bucks with Jason Kidd are playing really well. They actually have a winning record, and they beat some good teams. And I kind of looked into why. And what makes this interesting is there are really 4 players that account for why the Bucks are doing well currently. Brandon Knight, this is the real problem one. Giannis Antetokounmpo, John Henson, and Larry Sanders. Now we have 3 different stories here that kind of make sense. Giannis Antetokounmpo is a really, really young player. He was slightly below average as a rookie, but that's fine. Like, actually, LeBron James was slightly below average as a rookie. It's not a problem for a rookie player to be close to average, because that actually, gives you some hope, because we know players improve as they get older. He's currently playing at star level, so I don't know if he can sustain that, but the idea that he's had growth since year 1, I have no problem with that narrative. John Henson is a player, and this is kind of you start getting into the troubling areas, where John Henson on limited minutes 2 years ago played very well. Last year on more minutes played average, and this year is currently playing on limited minutes star level. So that one gets, we've seen up and down. Another good point though on John Henson, though, I believe, is he's also a young player. Then we get Larry Sanders, who's actually a player that Jason Kidd on Brooklyn was trying to trade for. He's a slightly older player, but we've seen him play. He was bad his first 2 years on limited minutes. Then with more minutes was, boom, star level. Then went back to limited minutes, I assume injury, played slightly below average, and is now playing slightly above average. So again, another narrative that's fine, though. A player we've seen play well in the past, still relatively young, starting to play well. The player that really terrifies me, but also may work out in their favor, is Brandon Knight. Brandon Knight for Detroit for 2 years was just terrible his first 2 years. Then he comes over to Milwaukee and, change of scenery doesn't really improve him. He's still freaking terrible. This season, he's playing close to star level. So the question you really have to ask yourself if you're watching the Milwaukee Bucks currently is first off, you've got a young core. Jabari Parker is a rookie and he's playing all right, which is good news for a rookie. But, I'm not, excited this far about him. But you've got four relatively young players that are all playing above average. That's their team currently. And the one question mark I have is Brandon Knight, because on Antetokounmpo, Henson, and Sanders, we have a very clear narrative that fits. They've been good in the past or are young, and we expect this growth. Brandon Knight has been terrible and is now great. And so the real question we have to ask ourselves as Bucks fans, I guess I'm a Bucks fan. That's Dave Barry keeps giving me crap about this. I guess because I live in the state of Wisconsin, I have to be a fan of the Bucks. I don't know if that applies. It is actually true of the Packers. When you cross the border and say you're going to live in Wisconsin and you get your driver's license, they go, by the way, you're a Packers fan and it's against the law not to be. So that is true, but the Bucks haven't heard anything about. So the real question we have to ask ourselves about the Bucks is if Brandon Knight's real. I don't know. I haven't actually done a lot of in-depth analysis because one thing he's doing really well is scoring. As you know, maybe I should start doing this as a column, Brian, but I do have basically the Klay Thompson shot chart watch. And I haven't really been watching Brandon Knight's shot charts to see if he's shooting smarter or whatever. But, that is part of the thing. He's been a below average shooter his entire career. This season at 56.3% true shooting, he's actually a good shooter. Is that going to hold up? Who knows? It's another chapter in small sample theater. But that did really just, blew my mind to finally see the Bucks. Who would have believed that, right? The Bucks were one of the worst teams ever. They actually have one of the worst records in NBA history. Have a winning record. I would not have believed you if you told me the Bucks were going to be in better shape than the Nuggets. But, that's the way it is. As always, Brian, anything to add on that before we actually wrap up the show?
No, I got nothing. Keep it going.
I guess I should chat that to you first, because I think sometimes you have a lot of really good, insightful stuff to say, and sometimes it's not. And that's kind of on me as the point guard. I've been watching a lot of ESPN documentaries, which we'll get into briefly, and I'm forgetting the one. But there's a case where the player last second passes the ball to the opponent. I'm sure that's happened lots of times, but it cost them a national title. And it's maybe I just did that. All right.
Well, my only thought on the Bucks is this: that Giannis Antetokounmpo has been so good lately that guys like you and me can actually kind of pronounce his name now. I don't think that was true last year.
I actually had to look up his name. First off, he's the Bucks are an interesting team. So if you're playing fantasy, he's one of those interesting players where you're going to want to look at those teams for scraping value. And I actually did learn to say his name, which is Giannis Antetokounmpo, and there's a great video of him saying it online. And, I'm one of the few players I'll actually learn to say the name, given, how much I butcher names like Kawhi Leonard. Or Kawhi Leonard. Jeez, I'm never going to get it right on the show. So if that's the case, we can head straight to shoutouts. I didn't ask you if you had any this week, Brian. So just type in the chat while I'm doing my shoutouts and let me know if you do or don't. That way we don't have another me passing the ball into the stands. And I'll give my shoutouts. These are actually, I feel bad I'm going corporate this week. So most of my shoutouts aren't for individual people. For big things. Last night I did see Big Hero 6, and I loved it. Now, by the way, from a plot point, this movie had so many plot holes, so many plot problems, so many narrative problems. I just love the character. There's so much to love about the representation in this movie. The main character basically is a mixed race kid, which is awesome. He does fall for the Disney problem where his parents are gone, because that's just Disney movies. But as a mixed race person myself, I love that representation. There were several females on the lead cast. They actually had different races. They had, the main premise is science is really cool. Just representation, characters, A+, kind of mucked it up on the story design, but that's life. Loved it. Go out and see Big Hero 6. Just a great Disney movie. I loved it. I actually liked the fact that when I pitched it to my wife to go see, I was after listening to the That Thing You Like podcast on. I said, I've got to go see this movie. She's like, I don't really like kids' movies, but we went and saw it. She really liked it. So Big Hero 6, go check it out. The other one, this is from you again, Brian, and feel free to chime in on any of this. But you mentioned that I should watch The Pony Excess last week. I think we were talking ESPN 30 for 30s. I loved it, and I've been on ESPN 30 for 30 kick. I know for a fact I saw the Pony Excess, the Demise of the Big East, the Survive and Advance. If you want, watch Survive and Advance if you want to cry. Um, lots of good ones. I think I forget the one I'm watching. The Youngstown Boys is what I'm in the middle of right now. For how much crap I give Grantland and 538 and ESPN itself, 30 for 30 is just a freaking home run. I believe Bill Simmons does it too. So ESPN 30 for 30, if the rest of ESPN could be at the same level as ESPN 30 for 30, I would be a happy camper. I love them. They were great. Did get me tweeting out a lot about college sports because one thing I noticed in the Pony Excess, you notice in these college sports movies, they'll do this. They'll say the team came to their house and had a briefcase with $25,000. And you listen to that and you go, oh my goodness. And then if you actually do the math in your head, you realize that this isn't really that much better than paying them as if they were a Walmart employee. Basically, $12.50 an hour is the hourly wage for about $25,000 a year. And if you actually look at what college athletes go through, I didn't expect to get on my college high horse, but I'm going to, Brian. When I was in grad school, I was a teacher's assistant. I basically got the same deal college athletes get, where my salary was paid. Well, not my salary. My tuition was paid for. I actually got some pay. I got a stipend, right? So I got some pay. So that was basically the same deal as professional. I call them professional athletes in college, except my deal was 20 hours a week of work, 20 hours of work a week, which was cake, which I did in the form of either grading or lecturing. Teaching 2 resuscitation. So this was like not the full class, but 2 1-hour lectures a week. It was the same lecture, but the 2 different segments. And then, just sitting in the class and being able to open to answer questions if students had it. That was it. And I guarantee you that was an easier job than any professional athlete. I didn't have to wake up early. I didn't have to do 2-a-days. I didn't have to put my body through stress. I could actually probably afford the health insurance the school offered, which wasn't covered, and it's not covered for athletes either. So this idea that professional athletes are basically offered to get paid like Walmart employees, and that's a scandal, just was driving me nuts in all of these ESPN 30 for 30s that I saw. But that's all I really got there. If you got anything to chime in on the 30 for 30 ones, Brian, let me know.
Yeah, another NCAA themed one that I watched recently was Brian and the Boz, about Brian Bosworth going to college and then briefly in the pros in the 1980s. Really interesting one too. And it's interesting overall how these ESPN properties are kind of rolling over on the NCAA a little bit when I think they wouldn't have in past years.
Well, one thing that was surprising to me, there was a good Cracked article. I love it that the Cracked comes in on this, but they said like 5 reasons the NFL is more evil than you think. And one of the things they brought up was that the League of Denial documentary that was put on by PBS, great documentary, check it out, was originally supposed to be sponsored by ESPN, and ESPN pulled out because basically the NFL came at them. So yeah, it is definitely surprising. But I think the reason the documentaries get away with it, and they actually do keep the narrative that this is a bad thing, this is a horrible thing, but it's one of those where as I'm watching it, I'm actually just looking at the facts and things and going, are you seriously telling me this is a problem, right? And in some cases they'll say this school, what was the one the Pony Excess, right? I think I tweeted about it. I was like, I was amazed in this documentary where they were basically calling like ending college sports in one town, like they called it like a crucifixion, a travesty, the worst thing that had ever happened to SMU. And I was like, this is college sports you're talking about. This is absurd. So I think some of the reason it works as a documentary is that they present the information, and if you basically pull yourself out, if you look at it from an outsider's view, you can see the absurdity. And I think that's why they're able to get away with it, because the talking heads do keep this narrative and mythos up of, oh, he broke the rules, or oh, that school broke the rules. But when you're watching it from the outside, you go, oh, this is absurd.
Well, and I also feel like stuff getting approved overall probably isn't an exact science. You always hear stories about directors submitting movies, and of course I know that ESPN's different from the ratings board, but you know what I'm trying to say. I think maybe just the name of League of Denial might have gotten them in trouble more than the content.
No, I mean, the whole point of League of Denial, and this is true. Yeah, sorry we got down this rabbit hole. I don't care though. Is that like the NFL actually invaded essentially an academic conference and essentially peppered them with papers that said concussions aren't bad, our helmets work, et cetera, and just basically steamrolled this academic conference, and then also basically sabotaged Amadou, I think that's how you say it, Bennett's career. They sabotaged the career of this one guy. And by the way, he was like, unfortunately, he was like an easy target because he was foreign. He had some weird thoughts. Like he was a morticianer. And so one of the things he would say is that the dead would talk to him. Like he would actually say it legitimately. So, right, he's an easy target to kind of PR hit, right? So it's just one of those, they actually did really go out of their way. And so it's not a surprise when there's a documentary about the NFL saying, here's all the horrible things the NFL did to steamroll this information out, that they went to that documentary and steamrolled it effectively. So that's, I mean, at least it's par for the course, right? I guess like the documentary, that's part of the truth of it. They're like NFL is really, really good at sabotaging efforts to show the concussion problem. And they got a documentary not made. So on the point of exploiting college athletes, Dave Barry did a great piece for Time, where basically, and I love this, this is what I love, is he basically said, if we make the assumption that the college scholarship is actually worth what teams say it's worth, athletes are still being exploited. Because this is one of those things that always drives me nuts when you start bringing up paying for college sports, is people are saying, well, they get an education. And what Dave Barry points out is, well, guess what? With the amount of revenue that's coming in and the amount that you would probably have to tie to the players, if you did, and so by the way, he does this brilliantly. He says North American sports all have roughly a 50-50 split in regards to administration, overhead coaches, et cetera, and players. So if the NCAA did that, 50% overhead, 50% to the athletes, and then we looked at how much that should pay per athlete, just even on just a net level, none of them is making tuition. Like all of them should be getting paid way more than their tuitions are worth, even at good schools. And it doesn't even factor in for schools with lower tuition. So I loved it. He actually, he was in the Northwestern case, and this was part of his point there, is when they said, do you think athletes are being exploited? He basically said, there is an economic term for exploitation, and you are hitting it. And I love these things. I love it when basically someone says, do you think this? And the answer can be, there is actually a textbook definition of that, and you are fitting that textbook definition. So great work by Dave Barry. Absolutely loved it. And then the last one I have, I'm going to try and do at least a shout out from the comments or tweets about show specific, was Iceman on the last post, because I remain on my high horse about defense. What I will say, by the way, is when people say defense is half the game when we're talking when it's produced, what you really mean is the on-ball defense that impacts opponent shooting percentage is what you're talking about. Is that's not what's not captured in the box score. That's only about 10% of the game. So defense may be half the game, but things like defensive rebounds, steals, blocks, personal fouls, those are captured in the box score. So when people say defense is half the game, it's a misnomer in regards to what they're complaining about with box score stats. What they really mean is, like I said, Dave Barry's done regressions that basically say this part that is not captured by the box score is roughly 10% of the game. So anyway, but even in that regard, basically pointing out that when people bring up Kobe's defense, which I still say he would have to be the greatest defender ever to even come close to Steve Nash, there's no such thing as a LeBron stopper in the NBA. And that is absolutely true. So Iceman, the no LeBron stopper. Dave Barry actually made this point, I think, on a podcast. I'm not going to find if one of you happens to know the one it was on. He basically said, you know, in baseball, in football, you have opponents that know what your team is going to try and do, and you make plans against it, right? In football, they say, we know Peyton Manning is going to try and throw the balls to these players, so block those players. Stop this. We know these are the routes they're going to try and run. Stop those routes. In baseball, he's really good at hitting these pitches. Don't throw those pitches. You know, one of the most recent advances, I guess you'd call it, in baseball is the switch, right? Where you basically move the shortstop over because the person's right-handed or left-handed. You have all of these things where you say, we are going to go out of our way to stop this player. And in basketball, every team knows LeBron James is the best player in the game. Why doesn't any team stop him? Because they can't. And that's the point. Is I think team defenses as a whole can do wise strategies, restrict players in the paint, restrict certain types of shots, but you don't have one player that you can just put out there. And actually, I didn't even consider this, but I want to get it in front, Brian. I may not be able to get it up in time. But, you know, one of the narratives in the history of the NBA is that in the finals against Michael Jordan, Gary Payton basically said, you know, put me on him, right? Like he basically pointed out that, hey, Michael Jordan, you know, he's doing really well. just put me on them. And, that's one of the, I guess, theories as to why the series swung. So I've got this in front of me, and it may have actually worked because Michael Jordan did go down. But I just don't know how much actually, Michael Jordan did not score below 20 points a game that entire series. Although, geez, his last game, 26.3%, and they still won the game. So, I just don't buy that you can shut down a player as effectively as these people are believing. And so that's just kind of my take on that. So those are my shout outs. Brian, you got anybody?
No, I got nothing, but I would say this is the textbook definition of a really great show tonight.
Okay. Thanks. All right. So next week is Thanksgiving week. I will actually be traveling. I may or may not, because I'm actually going to be seeing my brother, who, if for those of you who've been following my entire career, may actually recall, was on the very, very, very first They Were Wages of Wins podcast at the time. I may do a quick recording. We may give Brian a call just to see, chat some stuff up. Because as I've mentioned, we've got some exciting stuff coming up where we're planning on doing the show live. I think we did it live this week too, Brian, but we had so many technical difficulties. We may be a few weeks out, but we're probably just going to take next week off, say happy holidays, enjoy the Thanksgiving. If there's anything extra, we'll put it up and we'll let you know. But we'll see you back in about 2 weeks. And by then, I'm sure there will be many, many more narratives in the NBA to go over. So with that, happy holidays, and we'll see you in a few weeks.